Amelia Womack, Deputy Green Party leader for England and Wales. Ben Riley-Smith, Telegraph political editor. He's going to spill the beans on everything to do with Partygate, assuming that somebody actually asks us about Partygate, I guess. That's a hint, by the way. Albie Amankona is here, co-founder of Conservatives Against Racism for Equality. And Jo Phillips has finally made it to the studio after 3 weeks of trying. She was rained off last time, I think, or there was some reason why she couldn't get here, but she is here now, the political journalist and writer. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call if you'd like to put a question to our panel, and you can watch us on Global Player.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock. Russia says it's dramatically scaling back operations following peace talks in Turkey. But the US Secretary of State has suggested it could be an attempt to deceive people and deflect attention. Analysts say the pledge covers areas where Russian troops had already lost ground. Senior fellow at the Russia and Eurasia programme at Chatham House, Keir Giles, told LBC the UK should not believe what Russia says.
Well, one of the most startling things is not what Russia has said, but how everybody is reacting to it. It is as though everybody has forgotten that there is no point at all in taking at face value what the Russian Ministry of Defense says, because it has proven itself to be so utterly untrustworthy on every single occasion previously. Russia is saying that it is doing this to build trust, but it's actually pretty plain that this is a further recognition by Russia that they haven't succeeded in their war aims.
Boris Johnson is not among those expecting a fine following parties in Downing Street during lockdown. The Metropolitan Police has so far issued 20 fixed penalty notices, but may hand out more. The Health Secretary says free parking for NHS staff who work at hospitals in England will end on Friday. Parking fees were waived during the pandemic, and the move has been criticised by unions. In the city, the FTSE 100 closed up 64 points at 75.37. The pound buys $1.31 and €1.18. LBC weather, rain sinking southwards across the UK through the night, a low of -6. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Lottie Morley.
This is LBC from Global. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. We're going to do our level best to stop sinking southwards on this programme. It's Cross Question, it's Tuesday, it's 2 minutes past 8. On the panel with me in the studio, Jo Phillips, political journalist and writer, Amelia Womack, Deputy Green Party leader for England and Wales, Ben Riley-Smith, the Telegraph's political editor, and Albie Amankona, co-founder of Conservatives Against Racism for Equality. They're here to take your calls. The number, as ever, 0345 6060 973. And, of course, you can watch us, as ever, on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
A finer looking panel I don't think we've ever had in the studio. Welcome.
I bet you say that to everybody.
I don't actually. I don't think I've ever said it before. Christoph, I'm sure you're very fine looking too. In Wembley Park, what's your question, please?
Oh, thank you, Ian. Well, my question is this. If a Prime Minister believed that he or she could mislead Parliament without any serious consequences, what would that mean for democracy in this country?
Ben Riley-Smith.
Well, I think the key question there is, or the key word is mislead. And we've been putting lots of the developments to Downing Street today as part of our reporting. Obviously, it was announced that by the Met that these 20 fines have been issued. We don't know who to. We don't even know which of the 12 events it relates to. We're hoping that might come to light at some point. The Scotland Yard won't be naming anybody. But we've been putting it to the Prime Minister that, and the Prime Minister's team, that for months he's been saying all the guidance was followed, especially early on in Partygate. And now the Met appear to have concluded that all the guidance wasn't followed, and they have reached the conclusion that some COVID laws were broken and issued fines on the back of that. The response we get from number 10 is all about that word, mislead. Mislead suggests you knowingly know something to be untrue and are lying about it. And their argument today was when the Prime Minister said those things, he genuinely believed them. information.
Because he kept saying, "I have been assured," didn't he?
Was that without saying who was giving the assurances? And it's convenient, isn't it, that now most of the senior people in Downing Street at that time have moved on and been replaced. But the big debate about whether he broke the ministerial code of conduct and misled Parliament is going to be that idea of, did he lie, or did he simply say what he thought to be correct at the time, and which has since been disproved.
But this is what is so disgusting about the whole thing. It's like saying to your school teacher...
This is the voice of Joe Phillips, by the way.
The voice of anger, I tell you. Oh, well, I didn't know what Wednesday my homework needed to be on. You didn't say. And this is what is so... It is the hallmark of Boris Johnson's wriggling and squirming, that he's unable to say, yep, we got it wrong, there were some parties. I didn't know about them, or I was there. But this wriggling around on a technicality, it's embarrassing, it degrades democracy, it degrades Parliament, and frankly, it degrades the Conservative Party.
Do you think that the general public is still as angry about this as it was a few months ago, given that we're not at war, but we kind of are, if you see what I mean? And I just wonder whether, if he decides to brazen it out, that there are... Certainly, I don't detect, I mean, Ben, you know better than I do, but among Conservative MPs, I certainly don't detect any great move to displace him over this now. Now, that might be different when everything comes out in a few weeks' time. But, Joe, do you really think that the country is where it was on him a couple of weeks
I think
ago?
the country is still furious. I mean, today, as they send out the first of the 20 fixed penalty notices, as Ben has just said, is the day that the first heart was painted on the COVID wall by the Justice for the Bereaved group. It's also ironic, isn't it, that the Queen and her family paid tribute to Prince Philip when the night before the funeral of Prince Philip, there were people apparently boozing it up in Downing Street. There are people across this country who have gone through terrible privations and who abided by the rules. Now, you might think, well, the rules were stupid. Well, we didn't make the rules. The government made the rules. Therefore, they should stick to them. There were people being arrested or questioned and challenged for going for a walk, for sitting on a park bench with a friend. People, we know all of these stories. So I think there is a real pain that might not be so raw. And I agree with you that, yes, of course, what's happening in Ukraine has slightly taken the edge off it, because clearly, in real terms, that's much more serious, much more frightening.
Well, and I think I hesitate to say most, actually, but a lot of the country think that Boris Johnson has actually performed rather well in this crisis.
Well, if you want to be a Churchill tribute act, I suppose you could say that.
Zelensky has actually said that he thinks Boris Johnson has performed the best out of all of the Western leaders. That's not to say that takes away from the issue of Partygate. But I think what we have to think about with anyone who says, well, let's get rid of Boris, we actually have to think about how do we practically get there. So we need 54 letters to go in from the parliamentary Conservative Party. So MPs have to send in 54 letters. We recently saw some of those letters withdrawn, especially high-profile ones like from Douglas Ross, Andrew Bridgen, for example. So I don't see any mood in the Conservative Party to get rid of the leader. And I think that's the problem. There's no clear route to vote of confidence and a leadership election.
He could resign.
He could resign, but I don't think Boris is going to resign. I think if he was going to resign, that would have happened. And he seems to me to be a very lucky Prime Minister that this crisis has essentially come along and saved him.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think, it probably won't be Partygate that does for him. It will be the cost of living. But what will probably be the test for the Conservative Party is the May elections.
Well, that will certainly be one test. And, of course, they're, 5 weeks away now. Amelia Womack, you'll be hoping to do well in those elections, I imagine. What do you say? Let's remind ourselves of Christoph's question here. If a PM can mislead Parliament without any serious consequences, what does this mean for democracy in the UK?
I think it's been such a shameful time, really, for the Conservative government. I talked to people who lost relatives who the last time that they saw their mother was through the window of their home before they died during those lockdowns. It made a mockery of those losses when we found out that the Conservative government didn't think that those rules applied to them, that the party time was still on, business as usual, which the Conservatives always seem to do best. And it just shows what a failure of politics we have right now, We shouldn't be tolerant of lies. We shouldn't be tolerant of mistruths. We shouldn't be tolerant of misleading. And I think that it does show that our democracy is crumbling. I would obviously say we need a proportional system to ensure that we get better scrutiny. But right now, we need to be genuinely holding those people who give politics a bad name to account in this country. And it's Boris Johnson that is at the forefront of that. And I just want to be clear, he is just one bad apple in a cart of bad apples, because he is not alone in his lies.
Do you believe that he deliberately lied? Because is there a difference between a politician standing up in the House of Commons and saying something which they think to be true at the time but turns out not to be true? I cite Amber Rudd, when she resigned as Home Secretary because she said something wrong in the House of Commons, which it turned out that it wasn't her fault at all. I mean, there are... I mean, this word lie is an important one, but it can be used in different contexts, can't it?
Can we remember that there's a book about Boris Johnson and lying? And I don't know many people that have an entire book about their lies written about them. I think his character has been called into question time and time again. And if you're going to see what leadership is, actually maybe taking responsibility for your actions, like Amber Rudd did, would be a better way for Boris Johnson to act right now.
But if you're going to get rid of a Prime Minister, you need to be pretty sure that they have lied. And from what Ben said, it's going to be quite difficult to prove that, is it not?
I don't think it's the lying alone, though. So there's the lies. As I said, the man that has an entire book about him, lying about him.
That does not mean... I'm not defending him, but I'm playing devil's advocate, but that does not mean that he necessarily told a deliberate lie in this case.
But I'd also say that this is one disaster to the next. And if it isn't this that destroys him, it will be the next mistruth or lie. It will be the next failure to be able to look at the detail of information, like the failure that he had with Nazanin Ratcliffe. And time after time after time, he has shown himself not to be a statesman that is in service to this country. He's proved himself to be a statesman in service to his own ego.
What about Ukraine, though?
When it comes to Ukraine, then we could be doing so much more right here in the UK as well, because we're not talking about refugees. We are still failing those people who are on the forefront of the bloodshed of Ukraine. Let's not forget that Boris Johnson compared what's happening to Ukraine to Brexit. What a disgusting thing to say when lives are being lost.
Well, even he admitted he could have worded that better.
Exactly. Again, a lack of attention to detail, maybe even a lack of compassion right there.
Jo?
Well, I completely agree with what Amelia said. I don't think Conservative MPs, of which there are many decent ones, in the same way there are, bad politicians across all parties. It's not an exclusive trait of the Conservative Party. But it is their lack of spine, their lack of gumption and other bodily parts that are usually used to describe,
let's move on quickly.
But, they have allowed a known liar. We know he lost his jobs. He's been sacked for lying. We also know he lied to the Queen.
Yeah, and the electorate knew that he lied and they elected him.
Yeah, but now it is time that the Conservative Party should actually say enough is enough.
Okay. Christoph, what do you think?
Well, I think some people on the panel have sort of expressed my concern that if you can get away with it once, I'm not suggesting any Prime Minister has misled Parliament so far, but if you do get away with it once, maybe it'll become a habit, and that can't possibly be good for democracy. And if the electorate doesn't mind you lying to them, what does that mean for democracy?
Well, that's a big question, isn't it? Because I think that people on the left were, shall we say, rather surprised at the size of the Conservative majority, given what people already knew about aspects of the Prime Minister's character. Now, there were lots of reasons for that majority, but I think it did cause some surprise in some places. Christoph, thank you very much. Let's move on to another question from Kelvin in Boreham Wood. Hello, Kelvin.
Good evening. Does the panel think it's right for the government to differentiate how it handles the sanctions from the oligarchs, and if not, why not?
How do you mean differentiate? How are they treating them differently?
Abramovich, who owned Chelsea, and that was obviously a financial asset, they decided to sell it. But if they decided to sell it,
no,
the
that's wrong.
mansions, the luxury apartments, the super yachts,
you're wrong.
What's the difference? An asset is an asset.
Well, you're completely wrong in the fundamentals of your question, because the Chelsea Football Club was already up for sale when they froze Chelsea's assets, so that process had already been started.
But where's the money going?
I don't know the answer to that question. Ben Riley-Smith has opened his mouth, so I'm hoping he does.
Well, I think the answer is the government doesn't know the answer to that either, and it's to be determined. But there is an interesting point to that question, which is when someone's sanctioned, all of their assets are frozen. Mm-hmm. They can't sell a house, they can't sell a yacht, and yet a football club has been deemed to be something of such public value that the government has said, OK, we will try and allow a route for it to be sold. So there is a process going on. People are bidding. What happens to the money? It certainly won't go to Abramovich. I think it's to be determined where that money will go to. But they do seem to have made a judgment that somebody's posh house or posh boat is in a different category from a football club, which means a huge amount to community.
Which, I mean, Albie, do you understand the reason that they're doing that? Because, I mean, if you're a football fan, I mean, I'm not a Chelsea fan, but if I was, I would be thinking, well, this club has been around for over 100 years. This is part of our national heritage. Abramovich has been a custodian of it. Just because his assets have been frozen, that doesn't mean to say that the club should cease to exist. So I can understand that being treated a little bit differently.
Yes, I can completely understand why national treasures, if you want to call them that, like Chelsea Football Club, are being treated differently
I had to say
to people's to people's other assets like their houses or their yachts. But I wonder why there is this obsession with things like oligarchs' houses in Belgravia and their yachts, because actually the sanctions that really have the most impact on nations like Russia are the sanctions that we've seen on the SWIFT banking system and Russian banks being blocked from that, on things like semiconductor export controls, which basically stop Russia from being able to build any high-tech infrastructure, whether or not that's telecommunications, whether or not that's military equipment. Anything involves semiconductors. So really, the public should be focused on what more we can do to impose sanctions on Russia in those areas. And actually, if we could impose a similar semiconductor ban from China to Russia, as we've seen from the US to Russia, that would have a huge impact on the Russians' ability to succeed in this war and on their economy in the long run.
Amelia?
I think it's interesting that this was a question that we should have been asking ourselves back when Litvinenko was poisoned or the Salisbury poisonings happened, that we should have actually have been sanctioning oligarchs at that time then. So I think there's a public consciousness about this in terms of action against
Russia. On
Russia.
what basis would you do that? Because, I mean, I completely agree. I mean, there were sanctions after both of those incidents, but how could you have justified sanctioning individuals when that was clearly something that the Russian state was behind?
And I think that is something that we do need to be very clear about, is what is the Russian state and the role of Russian people. And I mean, right now, those brave people who are going out on protests and speaking out are just, really... they're putting their lives on the line right now doing that work. But it's about how we ensure that we weren't bending over backwards for Putin and the attacks that we were seeing, about ensuring that we were taking action and being seen to take action. So Putin, he's one of those, give him an inch and he'll take a mile. And we've given him that mile of inches quite easily. How
many inches in a mile?
Oh, you're asking the person who grew up in metric here.
Thanks for that was a slap down, wasn't it?
Wasn't it? Yes.
Anybody that can tell us the answer to that, 84850, you're older than me, so now, what's your answer to the question, Jo?
About sanctions, well, I mean, let's put this in context, because it was John Major and then Tony Blair who started this sort of golden visa gold rush into London.
Actually, it was Jackie Smith, the Home Secretary, that did that. I know that because she told me the other day.
But it certainly didn't begin and
no,
end.
You're right that the concept of attracting Russian money wasn't just from
No, there. Exactly. And I think, what we have done is been so enthralled, as the then Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, said, he loved the idea of being called Londongrad, and mixing with some people playing tennis with others and ennobling others who brought lots and lots of money. But we didn't do proper checks. We didn't do what any sort of sensible due diligence would do on who was owning this property, who was buying up stuff as it was even, before it was even built. I'm thinking of, all the building around Vauxhall, Nine Elms and all the places that have sprung up over the last 20 years. A lot of that was being bought by offshore companies, not individuals. And the downside of that at a very basic level is it's absolutely screwed London house prices, and it's put property in the hands of people who are probably supporting or using funds taken from the Russian people.
Okay, 0345 6060973 if you'd like to put your question to our panel. It's been a very good discussion so far. More of it in just a moment. You're listening to Iain Dale on Cross Question. It's 19 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
It's 22 minutes past 8. You're listening to Cross Question, 0345 6060973. No questions on Will Smith so far, but that could change, but that rather depends on you. We have with us in the studio Albie Amankona, co-founder of Conservatives Against Racism for Equality, which I always think is a really tongue-twisting title for an organisation. I think you need to get something a bit snappier.
It is a tongue-twisty title, and what we've been saying recently is just Conservatives Against Racism. So I'm sorry I didn't give you that update.
Okay, thanks. We'll have that. Ben Riley-Smith is political editor of The Telegraph, formerly known as The Daily Telegraph. Amelia Womack is Deputy Green Party leader for the Green Party of England and Wales. And Joe Phillips is a political journalist and writer. Now, let's go to Martin in Doncaster. Martin, what's your question, please?
Hi, Iain. Yeah, I'd like to ask, do you think the Queen got it right today, letting Prince Andrew escort her today?
Amelia Womack.
I do think that the Queen is the Queen for 365 days a year, and maybe just for one day she should be allowed to be a widow and a mother. And really, have no sympathy for Prince Andrew at all. But and I think that everything we've heard about him has been despicable. But on this day, I do think the Queen should just be respected as a grieving widow and a mother and a 95-year-old woman that was helped to her seat.
Good on you, is what I say. Albie.
I mean, I completely agree with Amelia on that point. It was obviously a very difficult day for Her Majesty, and she wanted her family by her side. It was a real shame, I think. I think the bigger question is that obviously the Duke and Duchess of Sussex didn't come, and I think that was awful. And as someone who has actually been, I would say, a supporter of that couple, even post-Oprah, I was really disappointed to see that. And I think on such a sad day, it was good to see most of the royal family rally behind the Queen. And I hope that her health ailments improve as quickly as possible so she can get back to doing what she loves doing, which is serving the people of this country.
Jo Phillips.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, she's entitled to have her son there, however despicable we might think he is and however arrogant he is. He's her son. Philip was his grandfather.
Father.
Father. But, as for Harry, as Albie says, I think Harry will regret this for the rest of his life.
It's very odd, isn't it? Because apparently the reason that he gave was he was worried about security.
Oh, for goodness sake.
The whole of the royal family and the Prime Minister in Westminster Abbey, I think there's probably a good bit of security
Exactly. Get over yourself, sunshine, and get on a plane.
Now, Ben, are you going to be the token Republican on the panel here? And
From the Telegraph, I would hope not.
well, stranger things have happened.
I'm certainly not, but the thing, I hadn't seen all the footage from today, but the thing that's just jumped out to me was those images of raw emotion on the Queen's face and her eyes filled with tears. I mean, it's pretty rare you see that. I can't remember the last time over years and years that we've seen that kind of raw emotion. And I think that will have a connection with the country, who understands, as well as this being a monarch, this is a mother and a widow, and just the raw pain that she was going through today is really quite stark.
OK, well, you're all in agreement, so I think we'll leave that one there. Well, Martin in Doncaster, are you going to break the agreement here?
Yeah, I just didn't think it was a good look. I love.
Does it matter?
No, I just think, over the last 2 years, the words she said, I think she's been fantastic. She's an amazing lady. And I just didn't think it was right. They could have chose Prince Charles or anybody else in the royal family to do it. And Prince Andrew's ego tonight must be massive. I know she's his son and that was his father, but surely they could have chose somebody else. I know it's the Queen's Day today and she deserves everything. She deserved the ceremony.
To be honest, and I'm not tugging my forelock here, but I think it's for her to decide who she wanted to accompany her at this. And frankly, in a way, I don't think it matters what anyone else thinks. It was the right decision for her, and that was it. Martin, thank you very much. I can tell you that there are 63,360 inches in a mile. Everyone, we've had about 20,000 people text that in, so if you could just stop that, I'd be really, really grateful.
And what is it in metric, Ian?
I don't care. You're so 2016, Jo Phillips. Right, Denise in Woolwich has texted in this question. Should Will Smith lose his Oscar, or does the lack of update today means he's got away with it? Well, there has been an update today because he's apologised, not just to the Academy, but also to Chris Rock, the man that he slapped. Albie, what did you make of all of this?
I found it a very depressing affair, to be honest. When we see a winner of one of the most prestigious acting awards in the world, a black man, and then another black man presenting that award on stage at one of the most famous stages in the world, to see one of them smack the other one when we're fighting a narrative of black on black violence was really disappointing. And I say that as a black man myself. But I think aside from the race issue, violence is never acceptable. And actually what I think would have been more effective is if Will Smith said something which was incredible and insulting to Chris Rock. I think that's what people would have remembered a lot more. And Will Smith is a very skilled wordsmith. I'm sure he could have come up with something which had more impact than that pathetic little slap that he did. And I just think it's a really sorry affair. And whether or not it leads to him losing his Oscar, I don't really care. But I just want Will Smith to know, if you're listening, that I think what you did was totally unacceptable, and I think you should be hanging your head in shame. Mm-hmm. But equally, Chris Rock's joke about alopecia was also shameful. Mm-hmm. And to have Mrs. Pinkett Smith sitting there in front of him to say that joke, alopecia for a woman, it's a big thing. Mm-hmm. It's a different thing for men losing their hair, as you know, Ian. But I think both of them behaved badly, and I'm just really sad that it happened at the Oscars earlier on this week.
And that was Albie Amankona making his last appearance on Cross Question. Amelia.
I agree. Someone very close to me has alopecia, and alopecia jokes are never funny. It's an experience, especially within women, that society gives no flexibility for. We talk a lot about people's self-consciousness about their appearance, but hair for women has become part of a beauty standard. And I think that we really have to, if there's ever a silver lining for this moment, I hope it's that we really hold to account the fact that alopecia was made as a joke, and actually the world should realise what this experience is to women, and how it does scrape away at their confidence, at sometimes even that kind of sense of femininity and things like that as well. Violence is also never an answer, and I think also just people shouldn't be tuning into the Oscars and see violence in that way. We should never condone violence in any format, but also hope that we can stop undermining those people who are experiencing whatever it is in their lives, but alopecia in this case.
Joe Phillips.
Isn't it a shame when we should be talking about the fantastic films, the fantastic achievement? Will Smith is only the second black man to have won the best Oscar, the best actor, after Sidney Poitier, which was how many years ago? I mean,
I've heard of him.
That's the achievement. Instead, we've seen this unedifying spectacle of two blokes having a punch-up like a couple of drunks in a pub car park.
Well, to be fair, it's only one of them that...
Yes, but it's that ridiculous insult. It wasn't very funny. It wasn't very relevant. And actually, you know, the reaction and everything from Will Smith was just awful. And the photograph afterwards with his wife and his poor children who just looked like they wished the ground would open up and swallow them. I mean, it's a real shame, and it's a disgrace that we are not talking about the achievements of so many people and who've achieved so much. Women, Jane Campion, sound recordists, costume designers, Kenneth Branagh's fabulous Belfast, all of these things. Coda, the film about deaf people. You know, all of this stuff, and we're talking about two blokes having a fight.
OK, we'll only do it for another minute. Ben?
Well, I think we're in total agreement. It was
again.
Shocking.
Come on,
but
for goodness' sake, give us some questions that they can disagree on.
To answer the actual question, though, whether he should be stripped of the award, I think that's something that's much more up for debate. If he had done the punch at one of the evening shows, should he have been stripped of the award? If he'd done it 2 days later in a bar and it emerged 6 months later, I mean, there's a whole litany of fabled Hollywood actors who I'm sure have got into these types of scrapes. Clearly, the questions come up because it was the immediacy of it. You know, he got given the award minutes later. But I think there is a debate about what the punishment for that should be. And you wonder if, in reality, the punishment is going to be a hell of a lot of filmmakers probably won't hire him for the films they're thinking about, because he's now...
Oh, I bet they will. I mean, it's done wonders for his profile. People may not agree with what he's done, but I mean, he's an even bigger star now than he was before, isn't he?
You don't think anybody will pause and think, well, hang on in this?
I think people might.
But you actually, the only one of you four who answered the question, do you think that he should have the Oscar taken away from him?
No, there's no point.
Amelia?
I think he probably should have the Oscar taken away from him, because that kind of conduct should be held to account.
Albie?
I think it's a matter for the Academy. I don't have a particular strong inclination in either direction, but we do need to send a very strong message that kind of behaviour is unacceptable, on stage or off stage.
Right, will we have more agreement in the first half and the next half an hour than we had in the first? It's not really possible, is it?
Correlation.
It's 8:32 on LBC. Lottie Morley has the news headlines.
The Pentagon says Russia is repositioning forces around Kyiv rather than withdrawing. Russia said earlier it would be dramatically cutting back military operations in parts of Ukraine after peace talks in Turkey. The boss of P&O Ferries has rejected one further opportunity to rehire 800 staff who were sacked. Peter Hebblethwaite says the move would lead to the company's collapse and thousands of additional job losses. And tonight's Concert for Ukraine is now underway in Birmingham. Nile Rodgers, Emily Sandé and Ed Sheeran are among the artists performing to raise money for people affected by the war. LBC weather, rain sinking southwards across the UK through this evening. So showers for northern Scotland, a low of -6.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 8:36 on LBC. We have Albie Amankona, Ben Riley-Smith, Amelia Womack and Joe Phillips with us in the studio. Brian wants to know, why is no one wearing headphones tonight? Well, we've all got implants now. I joke. We have little earpieces because it looks better on camera. If you're watching us on Global Player, it's a much more pleasurable viewing experience, I imagine. Right, let's go to our next question. It's from Chris in Brecon. The Secretary of State for Health announced... Oh, he's a caller. Sorry, I thought it was going to be a text. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Ian. Hello, folks. How are you?
Hi.
All
Very
right.
well, thank you.
Yeah.
What would you like to ask?
Well, my question is, with the cost of living crisis, has the Health Secretary today delivered another kick in the teeth for all health workers in England, because we don't get charged in Wales, by scrapping their free parking charges?
Joe Phillips.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely ridiculous. In fact, when I heard it on the news, I thought, how can this government continue to get things so wrong? We know the cost of living is crippling people and it's going to get worse. And if you have to work shifts and you can't use public transport, surely you should be able to park at your place of work or have some subsidised parking. It's utterly, utterly ridiculous. And, you know, it goes back to that. Again, the gesture politics, the virtue signalling of this government. Let's all stand outside and clap for carers. Well, that doesn't pay the bills and it doesn't help you park the car.
No, and at that time, they weren't charging people to park their cars during the pandemic.
Right. No, I know. But
Okay.
I mean, you know, what's the point? 1 minute you're clapping them and saying they're heroes. I mean, I've got a son who's a paramedic, as you know. And I know how hard they work all the time. And he doesn't have to park at the hospital. But
what
nurses
about, I mean, again, let me play devil's advocate. I'm not saying this is necessarily my view, but there are plenty of other public sector workers who do vital jobs. They have to pay parking charges. Why should people in the health service be any different from anyone else in the public service?
Well, who give me another
Local
example.
government workers, for example, they
government-
possibly have to pay. I don't know, but there will be other categories
local
of
government
public
workers
sector workers who have to pay.
probably don't have to work night shifts or peculiar shifts, which most hospitals and most health service workers do. I mean, I'm not suggesting necessarily that people who are 9 to 5 office work or something like that, because there's other ways of dealing with it. But if you work shift work, you know, and you're a nurse or you're a healthcare assistant, and you come out of work and you think, oh, blimey, you know, I've just had to work an extra hour, in essence, to pay just to park my car. And also, public transport outside of London is rubbish.
She does live outside London. She knows of what she speaks. Ben?
Well, I can't claim to be across all the details of the latest announcement, because I thought they were generally driving to stop, well, excuse the pun, trying to stop the payments in hospital car parks. But it does speak to this general huge political issue that is already seen emerging and will probably be the biggest domestic political issue of the year, which is this cost of living crisis. You know, inflation, the OBR said last week, it's going to hit 7.4% this year. By the end of the year, it could hit 9%. Energy bills doubling, possibly tripling, prices soaring across the board, wages stagnating. The Treasury is in a tricky position because there's so much of this is global. It's the supply issues that came on the back of the pandemic and the reopening after lockdown, fueled by this the problems of the Russian invasion in Ukraine and grain prices and Russian oil and gas, our attempts to cut that off. There is only so much the Treasury can do because this is global, and yet there's going to be huge pressure from voters and a lot of MPs to say they have to go further. And so that's one example is, you know, can we spend a bit more money to ease the impact on people who work from hospital?
Can I just tell you...
It's going to be a million of these different areas where it's going to hit.
I know, but it's like, really? People who work in hospitals? Can I just tell you a story about my local hospital?
If it's brief.
It is very brief. So they built one of these sort of pop-up Nightingale hospitals, not at the beginning of COVID, sometime towards the end of last year. Up it went in the hospital car park. Nobody used it. Not a single person used it because they couldn't staff it. And it's actually, they didn't need it for that.
That's a good thing, though, isn't it?
That's a good thing. But actually, if they thought about it, they could have been using it for doing other things if they could have got the staff to, you know, whistle through MRI scans and other stuff, and knees and hips and cataracts. So they've now dismantled it. But in the process, they've ruined the car park, which is now going to cost £3 million to repair. So you tell me where that makes any sense at all.
Well, I mean, I don't know what the annual cost of nurses and doctors and NHS admin staff parking in their hospital car parks is, whether it's sort of 20 million, 100 million, 500 million. But Amelia Womack, I suppose the logic behind this government decision has to be, well, look, we're borrowing so much. We've got to try and recover as much money as we can, even if it is off the back of NHS workers.
I mean, where is that logic? It's where's your priorities? And if putting more costs on to NHS workers is something that you're going to just check through, it's just a really incredibly short-sighted system. I'd want to add to this hospital car parking fees that also the charging for lateral flow tests coming through. Now, again, there's a rising cost of living and people should be able to control and monitor their own health. I can't think, and if any of your listeners know of any, I cannot think of a single case, as another example, where people have to pay for medical testing.
Well, I'll give you an example. On my arm here, I have a diabetic testing thing that's stapled into my arm, which I have to pay £25 a week for. So I mean, that's something, because I'm a type 2 diabetic. If you're a type 1, you get it free. I don't expect to have it. But then I think, well, OK, I can afford to do that. But what about somebody who's living in a council flat on a low wage? Absolutely. They couldn't possibly afford to pay £25 a week. So their health will suffer because of that. So in the end, somebody somewhere, whether it's a government minister or somebody in NICE or the NHS, they have to make a decision as to what is going to be paid for. A friend of my sister's, she's been diagnosed with a brain tumour, that if it was treated, it could give her 2 years extra on her life. And she's launched a petition in Parliament to try and get the regulations changed, because it would cost £250,000 for her to get those 2 years. Now, where do you put the value on life in that? But that would be another £250,000 per person on the NHS budget. Someone somewhere has to make these decisions.
Yes, but those same people should have been a little bit more sensible and a little bit more diligent in looking at the loans that were given to COVID companies.
That's a classic bit of whataboutery, if you don't mind me saying so, isn't it?
Well, I don't know about whataboutery. I've never heard that phrase before, but it is. This is ridiculous. We've got a government that can turn a blind eye to money going hither and yon into the pockets of mates and cronies. We've got that utterly useless test and trace system.
So, Joe, does that mean that we should spend more money that we don't need to spend on services that people can actually afford to pay? So, look, I think it's always really hard when we speak about this issue of government spending, because when we look at things on a micro or individual level, there are lots of instances where we think it seems unfair. But when we look at it on a macro level, we're looking at paying £83 billion this year in servicing our debt interest alone. That's more than on education, more than on defence, half of the NHS budget, and we need to find ways to bring government spending under control. Now, I'm not saying we need to pay off the debt from the pandemic in the next 10-year period. We should probably look to do that over decades or centuries like we did after the last World Wars, but these are the issues that the Chancellor is facing. And if people can afford to pay for services that were provided free during the pandemic, not free from taxpayers, like lateral flow tests, like free hospital parking, I think there's a different argument. We're talking about the universal credit uplift. We've got to decide which services we're going to be providing for the public on behalf from the taxpayer as opposed to the private wallet.
But I get that, Albie, and of course there has to be a bit of a quid pro quo on the whole thing. But in terms of how this looks,
so what would you cut then, Joe? If you agree that we should bring debt spending, we should bring debt down, what would you cut?
I mean, I would tax fossil fuel companies. I'd make sure that there was a genuine wealth tax and ensure that there was a redistribution of finances.
The deficit is £100 billion. What else would you cut?
138, actually.
Thank you.
But
even worse.
Start looking within the health service. Throwing money at the health service isn't necessarily the answer. Training staff to operate expensive equipment and make sure that the hospitals are sweating the assets and getting people through and dealing with the waiting list. Because, Amelia's example, your example of the lady with the brain tumour, that is only
it's difficult to tell us apart.
I know,
isn't it?
You've both got such similar hairstyles. It's extraordinary. But it's these stories are going to get far worse because of the waiting list, which we know have been caused by the COVID pandemic. But in terms of how the government looks, we've got a Chancellor who is, by all accounts, not delivered on the budget, and that is a sort of general sort of media thing. He is seen as a millionaire.
Well, he is a millionaire, multi-millionaire.
Well, I know. So you've got somebody who's tone deaf.
Just because you're a millionaire, that does not necessarily make you tone deaf, does it?
It makes you tone deaf to how it... Look, Iain, you and I have both worked in politics for a very long time. The perception in the public is, oh, great, so now you kick the health workers. You know...
No, I totally get
the people that should be paying for the crisis absolutely are not health workers.
Yeah. The other huge problem they have, that Rishi Sunak has as Chancellor, is for years and years and years and years, the Tories have told us there is no magic money tree. If you want to get the money, you got to raise it from somewhere. Then the pandemic hit, in the click of their fingers, they got 400 billion of spending from somewhere.
That's
They
right.
borrowed a hell of a lot. So now they have to make the argument, which has been the opposite argument they've done for the last 2 years, which says, no, borrowing's really important. We've got to get debt down. But people will say, well, hang on, 18 months ago you managed to get all this money for tests and doctors and nurses.
But there was
Why
never
can't
a
we do that
magic
again?
money tree in the first place.
No, I know,
That's the
but-
point that I'm making. And what do we want the Chancellor to do? Either borrow more, tax more, or cut public services, and none of those are things that anyone wants to hear. But we need to have a grown-up conversation about public spending in this country and how we bring it.
But we need to have, at the risk of being accused
the services that we love
of whataboutery again, is that we actually do need to say, you got it wrong. Claw some of this money back.
Yes.
Look at where the money went. You know, mates of Matt Hancock's who texted him who'd been running a pub.
That never happened.
Apparently not. But, you know, there are lots of places where the money did not get used properly, and we know because we've seen a government minister in the Lords resign.
I'd actually, on your point on people not wanting to be taxed, I talk to people who are really angry that there are companies like Amazon who free-rided during COVID, were turning it into an opportunity. They used our streets, they used our health service, and at the same time didn't pay their fair share of tax.
Okay.
And I think that there are lots of people that want to see an equitable and equal tax system in the UK that sees those big companies and the richest in society paying their fair share to ensure that there are people that aren't being played politics with their health.
It's 8:48.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
Amelia Womack, Ben Riley-Smith, Albie Amankona and Joe Phillips here. Joe has got an apology to make, haven't you, Joe?
Yes, I got it completely wrong about Sidney Poitier
You
and Will
did.
Smith.
There are five.
Five.
Hashi Mohammed, who's often on this programme as well, he's texted me to say Denzel Washington, Samuel L. Jackson, Morgan Freeman and Sidney Poitier.
Yeah, and I'm really sorry. I apologise. But it shows what a film buff I'm not.
You are forgiven. Right, let's take a text question from Steph in Market Harborough, who says the UK is aiming to quadruple offshore wind power in renewable energy push. Isn't it time to build more wind farms onshore? Controversial, Amelia Womack?
I don't think it is controversial. We need to ensure that we have wind energy as part of our energy mix. And frankly, the government's been playing politics with renewable energy for far too long. I think it's interesting in Wales because of the devolution package that we have there. Energy is devolved, but everything except for wind. Because because the Conservatives were working against offshore wind is in the powers of the Welsh Parliament, but onshore isn't. That's just how politicised it is and how against onshore wind the Conservative government has been. And I think it's really important that we're... I don't believe it is the same as Scotland because the devolution package in Scotland is the opposite. So they have everything except. So it will be... pensions and all of the kind of things that are delivered nationally. So they, instead of getting additional parts to their devolution package, they had things that were just not part of it.
So in Scotland, they could make their own decisions about onshore wind.
And have.
They have they?
We have seen, well, obviously Greens are in government in Scotland as well.
I was about to come to that.
Even before they...
I'm trying to imagine a whole host of wind farms across the Scottish Highlands. I mean, that would surely be unacceptable.
As you get the train up into Scotland, there's a whole wind farm along that track. And you know what? I think it's pretty beautiful because it really complements the landscape. And it's just shows that Scotland is doing its part in terms of transitioning to renewables. And at a time of unpredictable geopolitics, where energy has become a weapon of war, that actually bringing that energy to the local level and ensuring that we have power over our own power is really important. So yes, it is time to bring more onshore wind and genuinely invest in renewables. Right now, what will get us out of this crisis is a Green New Deal. It will be about investment into renewable energy. It will be about public transport. It will be about changing our systems. For too many decades now, oil, gas has been the centre focus of conflict.
Ben Riley-Smith, your readers at the Telegraph are going to be outraged by this.
Well, our editorials in the past have been pretty firm about having concern about this. I mean, I find the politics of this fascinating. So Boris Johnson has become a climate change zealot, absolute believer in it. We saw that with COP last year. Even more so now with attempting to cut off Russian oil and gas. He's got this new drive about, okay, how do we become energy independent and move to cleaner energy? One of the things he really wants is nuclear, but he's been constrained by money. It costs 25 billion to build these things. And so we previously talked about money is tight.
Also, they take a long time to build.
And they take a long time to build.
It's not really an
some
acceptable
people,
solution.
including Kwasi Kwarteng, the business secretary, are saying, what about onshore wind? That's very quick to do. But there you have this other constraint, which is the traditional Tory scepticism, criticism about onshore wind. You know, it became a kind of central bit of their opposition to New Labour and Cameron's era that they were against these things. They effectively banned them in England. I think if you look back, something like 8 or 9 of Boris's current cabinet ministers signed letters trying to stop onshore wind in the past. So if the Prime Minister really wants to go for it, how does he square internal Tory critics in the Tory shires, and the opinion pages of right-leaning newspapers?
Because the problem is you can't put them up in areas where you think, well, they're not very beautiful. I mean, inevitably, you're going to put them on sort of green and pleasant land, aren't you? But
I mean, Iain, we've had pylons marching across England's green and pleasant land for donkey's years. I mean, I know you and I had this conversation.
I used to be obsessed by pylons when I was a child.
I wasn't going to reveal that, but now you've brought that out.
I would literally count them on every country.
Yeah, all right. Okay. Yeah, maybe another time, eh?
Okay.
Go back into your childhood. But, we've got those things. the Prime Minister wants to build nuclear power stations. Well, they're not particularly attractive. I mean, there is a sort of a strange beauty in Dungeness because of the bleakness. But we have actually, and it would be very interesting to see whether people's minds have changed from what Ben's just said. People now are facing the reality of the cost of gas and oil. People are also really confronting, one would hope, the NIMBYism, which is, OK, I mean, we've had it where I live, huge opposition to a solar farm. But my view is that has got to be better than a housing estate which puts more cars on the road.
Okay.
I was talking to an MEP in Germany, and they had really strong community renewables, things like onshore wind. And because it was owned by the community, you didn't get NIMBYism because people were getting cheap electricity.
Okay, let's bring in Albie.
I agree that we do need to be building more onshore wind. I find it interesting that the Tory faithful seem to be opposed to onshore wind but seem to support fracking. I actually support both of them because both a mixed energy policy is going to be important for power over power, as Amelia says, and we can't in the short term all of a sudden get energy independence from just going down the renewable route. There will need to be a stopgap of fossil fuel power stations, and eventually we'll phase them out. But I do think if we're looking at how are we going to bring more energy independence onshore, we need to be looking at fracking, and we also need to be looking at North Sea oil exploration as well.
Amelia's face is a picture.
I mean, fracking simply isn't an option.
Why isn't it an option? I think it's a great option.
Earthquakes, it pollutes the environment. It's another form of gas. There's methane leaks.
So in the meantime, before we get to renewables, how do you suggest we fill that stopgap?
Well, at the moment,
renewables are really quick.
There's just under 650 permits places that have been granted permits.
You've not answered my question. How do we fill the stopgap without fossil fuels?
For wind and solar, and that will actually meet the amount of energy that we currently get from Russia. And so these quick ways that we can be putting in renewable energy that doesn't have the controversy of fracking, like in Texas, the birthplace of fracking. I mean, people are against it there because of the impacts that it has on communities, and they're not as densely populated as we are. You've got vast swathes of land, and the fracking actually takes place quite far away from people's homes.
Shall we end with a lighter question? I don't think you two are ever going to agree on that one, are you?
No, we're not.
Colette in Newcastle in County Down, I didn't know there was a Newcastle in County Down, says Tory MPs are meeting the Prime Minister for a party this evening. Will he remember this one? It sounds like an awful party to me, all those Tories in one place. Ick. What's the worst party you've ever been to? Albie.
Oh gosh, the worst party I've ever been to.
Did it involve Tories?
No, it didn't involve Tories. I don't actually hang around with that many Tories outside political circles because most people my age are very much left-wing, but that's another discussion we can have. What is the worst party I've ever been to? It was probably a pre-drinks that I went to at university when I was part of the rowing club. Really awful drinks, mixing all of these drinks in this pan in front of me.
Ooh.
And the whole experience, looking back at it, probably wasn't something I should have done, but at the time I enjoyed it. I look back a bit differently, I think, now.
Amelia.
I went to a friend's 30th at her aunt's house, very low-key event, and 2 emergency services got called. One because the birthday girl got locked in the toilet and the door just froze and the lock went and she couldn't get out, so the fire service had to come. And the other was that she'd got a bouncy castle for her 30th and 2 people were bouncing on it. One person went up as the other went down, and there was broken nose and bloodshed.
Sounds like did she think it was the Chippendales or one of those sort of, birthday telegrams, people dressed up as firemen and...
No. She really wanted a very, very low-key event, and then 2 emergency services arrived.
I got locked in the toilet when I was a 5-year-old at a friend's birthday party, and they had to kick the door in. Jo Phillips.
I hate parties. I absolutely loathe parties, but I think now is the time to reveal to the world that you and I got manhandled out of a party in Harrogate at a Tory party. Well, I wasn't going to name him.
Yes.
And he wasn't Sir Mike Penning.
No,
he wasn't an MP either.
No.
And
he was an oik at that point.
He certainly was, and he manhandled us out of an event at Harrogate.
What happened?
After that, he went on to become a Knight of the Realm, and Iain and I are here.
Here we are.
Please, can we just have an hour of you two talking about your stories
Well, actually,
together?
funny you should say that, because I've just recorded an hour-long podcast with Jo Phillips, my All Talk podcast, which will be released in a few weeks' time. So I've granted you your wish. Ben,
Well, very embarrassing. I'm going to talk about a party I hosted myself with some friends when I moved to London. We had very little money after university. We thought it'd be a great idea to try and... There was a recipe we saw, which was cooking chicken on a barbecue on a can of beer. But we made the simple error of not being able to heat the barbecue enough. So this semi kind of not very cooked chicken sat there, not getting hotter. We all got drunk, went away, and the next morning it was still there, and we had to clean up this kind of half-cooked, half-raw chicken on a beer can. No, we didn't eat the chicken.
Thank goodness for that, because I think...
Not sure I'd be here.
Well, that went in a different direction, didn't it? Ben Riley-Smith, Joe Phillips, Amelia Womack and Albie Amankona. We could go on for another hour, but I see Barry Gardner waiting to come in for the next hour of the... Oh, my God, he's just blowing me a kiss. Thank you very much. I need a few minutes.
It wasn't for you, you say.
I need a few minutes to recover from that, so let's go to the news at 9 o'clock with Lottie Morley.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock. The Pentagon says Russia is repositioning troops around Kiev, not withdrawing. Russia said earlier it would be dramatically cutting back military operations in parts of Ukraine after peace talks in Turkey. Moscow insists the move is designed to promote trust during the